A few years ago, I worked at a Jewish summer camp in northern Georgia. As many of you may know, Georgia is a fairly conservative state, as well as being predominantly Christian. There are a small number of Jewish communities and a few summer camps. I'd say that this summer camp was more culturally Jewish than it was religious. There were no religious requirements nor specific religious focus. Rather, it was a place for kids who are often in the minority to come to a camp that allowed them to meet some kids like them. Staff came from all over. We had many Australians, a lot of British people, and a few Israelis and people from various areas of the U.S. Each night at around 10 o'clock, most of the staff were able to go out on the town for a couple of hours, whilst enough staff remained behind to watch over the cabins. This particular night, a group of about 5 of us decided to go to a local bar to grab a few beers. It had been a hot day and was extremely humid that night. Generally, we were extremely well received by the community despite differences. We brought in lots of revenue for the town during the summer months. We bought supplies at the local Walmart and often took the campers on tubing trips, or occasionally out to dinner after a long hike on the Appalachian Trail. It was midsummer, so we'd been out to the bars in the area many times already that season. The 5 of us sat around a table drinking and discussing the events of the day, as fellow employees typically would after work. About 30 minutes in, a white man in his 20s comes up to our table. I distinctly remember a jagged scar on his cheek but didn't think much of it at the time. He introduced himself and told us that he was having a party that night at his place. He said, "Black, white, gay, straight, don't care, just come." I found it odd that he'd opened his speech with a disclaimer. Of course, the party should be open for everyone. Why did he feel the need to specify? But we'd all had a few beers and were feeling pretty loose. He talked for a bit longer and nothing really seemed off. We told him we were working at the camp in the local area and couldn't stay, and that we would probably be heading back soon. An hour later, our group went out to the parking lot to get into the car. As we approached it, we saw the same guy come out of the shadows. He had a buddy with him with a shaved head. His expression was incredibly hateful. His eyes had changed. He pounded his fists into his hand and then took off his shirt and revealed a poorly inked SS tattoo. My stomach dropped. One of the bigger guys in my group, Kevin, immediately reacted by pulling out a knife from his back pocket. At summer camp, most of us staff carried knives because we spent a lot of time building campfires, etc. We asked what they wanted. The original guy started shouting some anti-Semitic remarks and told us he was going to beat us down. Kevin started walking towards the 2 guys, but we pulled him back. He told us his buddies were on his way, and sure enough, some more guys started walking into the parking lot. It's all kind of blurry here. I remember jumping into one of the cars, pulling Kevin with us, and it felt like we were surrounded. They were probably only about 7 or 8 of them. Rocks were thrown at the car, and we sped off. My heart was beating like crazy, and we never went back to that bar. On the bright side, when we told the story to the competing bar in town, the bartender lined up 6 shots, cheers to us, and said that we'd always be welcome in his bar and in that town. We had no problems in the town itself, or when I took some campers on a 2-day hike up the Appalachian Trail.
On March 4th, 2008, I had my one and only encounter with a black-eyed kid. Before my experience, I had never heard of anything having to do with their black eyes. I was 12. I was sitting outside of a hairdresser's in an old Chevy pickup, waiting for my mother to get her hair cut. About 15 minutes had passed, and I saw some kid walking back and forth along the sidewalk in front of my parked car. At first, I thought I recognized him as one of my friends from school, so I banged on the front windshield until he looked my way. When he turned, I realized it wasn't anyone that I knew. At this point, I wasn't scared at all. Not yet. The boy walked over to my side of the car and just stared at me. I get a good opportunity to look at him, and I am drawn to his midnight eyes. They freaked me out. If you have never seen a black-eyed kid, you have no idea what to imagine. Pupils as black as the night sky. The boy whispers, and then I lock the car and duck down into the space below the seats. I heard a light tapping on the window, but I ignored it. After about 5 minutes, he was gone. When my mother got to the car, she told me that a boy had gone to the window of the hairdresser's and had been asking my mother for her keys. She refused, and eventually he went away. I'm so happy nothing worse happened that day.
Tonight, my sister, brother-in-law, and 2 friends and I all pile into a truck, and we head out to the desert near the old Portland concrete factory. About half an hour into driving, kicking up dust and messing around, everyone gets the chills, and my anxiety starts to flare up. We brush it off as the temperature difference and just keep going. 10 minutes later, we come around a corner and my sister says, "Please tell me you guys just saw that woman." We respond with, "What woman?" She says, "We just passed a woman standing on the side of the road wearing pink, I think it was a pink shirt, and she had blonde hair that was covering her face. She looked dead." I honestly thought she was messing with me, so we turn around and go to the spot where she saw her. No woman. Brother-in-law and I get our flashlights out and look around. No woman, I tell my sister. She's seeing things, and she insists that she saw a woman, so I decide to check my dashcam footage. Sure enough, there was a woman. She was crossing the road, it looks like, and she just vanishes into thin air. My camera isn't of the best quality by any means, and it was quite dark, but it's clear what we saw. My brother-in-law and I canvassed a 2-mile square radius with flashlights, calling out to the woman because we legitimately thought that someone was lost out in the desert. The entire time we kept feeling and hearing things around us. Some info to note, this was right next to an extremely murky pond. There is a possibility that her body could be hidden in the pond.
I was hiking through the remnants of a remote, long-abandoned town and the surrounding area to get us far into the woods that I was. You had to cross a fallen tree over a creek 3 separate times. I had just crossed the 3rd bridge. It was about 5 miles in, and something blue caught my eye. Just ahead of me, there was a man in his late 60s wearing blue satin pajamas, sitting in a tree. The closer I got to him, the louder he laughed. It wasn't a maniacal laugh, but it set off alarms in my head nonetheless. He also wasn't wearing any shoes and looked very well dressed and put together. I gave him a friendly nod as I passed, and he just kept laughing. Then it stopped. I turned, and he was gone. No branches cracked, no plants rustled, no sounds were made. He was just gone. Still rubs me the wrong way. The area I was in was pretty rough, very secluded for hiking. Not very many people venture as deep as I did that day, and I still have no idea what was going on there.
I've heard a lot about coyotes and skinwalkers, and had a weird experience or two with coyotes. The creepiest being that they went up to my sleeping bag and were sniffing around us without us hearing them during the night. But never anything paranormal, so to speak. My friend Patrick's story, however, kept me going back to a favorite backcountry secret stash. He was leaving the area one morning. He'd been camping out there a couple of days, and said that there was a coyote that always seemed to be close by in his peripheral vision, but never overt. He loaded up his truck and started to drive down the washout to the fire road. At the end of the wash, he could see the coyote following him. When he pulled onto the road, it was running next to him. Now he was freaked out, so he sped up and said he was going at 35 or so, and it was running along beside him. Definitely not possible. When he looked back, the coyote was running on 2 legs, and was wearing what Patrick said looked like buckskin pants. An instant later, it was a person wearing coyote fur keeping pace with the truck. He looked again, and it was gone. We never went back to the Grove after that night.
I am originally from India. My parents sent my sisters and me to an Indian summer camp so that we could learn more about our culture. At the time, I was around 14. I was the standard young and cute kid. I'd been going to this camp for a couple of summers, and this particular summer was an important one. The teachers were extremely excited because they had a yoga guru of some sort visiting. I think he was around 60. He would teach us traditional music and dance. He started noticing me right away and kept making comments about how well I was doing things. As the summer continued, I would frequently find him watching me and talking to the teachers about me. Whenever he fixed my pose, he would linger a little too long. These things kept happening, and I started to become aware, very aware, of his presence. Flashed to the end of the camp, and it was a couple of days before the ending ceremony. A few girls ran up to me and said that he had candy in his room, as he was staying at the camp. They said he would give me some if I went up. I really had a craving for sugar, but I didn't feel comfortable going alone. So I had a few girls come with me. He gave them candy right away, and they left. When I asked for some for me, he motioned for me to come inside his room. I shook my head. He kept trying to get me inside his room. Finally, he gave up after I wouldn't budge and asked for a kiss in exchange for the candy. Something inside my mind told me to run, and I started backing away and booked it. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just knew something in that situation wasn't right. I think I told my parents, but never went back to that camp again. In hindsight, it's quite terrifying to think if I'd have wanted that sugar bad enough, would I have gone to his room, and what would have happened next? Regardless, creepy pedo, let's not meet again. Meet.
I live in rural Ohio. One of my friends owns a nice barn and farmhouse out of the sticks where the buses don't run, and where there's absolutely no service. He doesn't actually live there. His family owns the house for shits and giggles. They're millionaires. We'd never run there before, and it's a pretty scene in wood, so we decided that we'd give it a shot. He and I ran cross-country, and our team went to state that year, so we were in really good shape. We get to his barn and plan on running 8 miles near a road and then through the woods. We have GPS watchers, so we can make our own path and even turn back on 4 miles, or make a looping part if we desire. About 2 miles off the road, we took a random gravelly road through the woods, and there was a hiking path, so we decided to take it. We live in the country, so it isn't really a big deal. We've done this sort of thing before. I've gotten lost in the woods a few times throughout my high school, but we've never done it here and we were so far away from home. I didn't run with my glasses. Now those blinders of that, I'm making good pace when all of a sudden, I smack into my friend. I look up and he's just standing there. I focus in on what he's looking at, and there are bear traps hanging on a branch right in front of us. Looking around, there's more, all blowing in the breeze like wind chimes. Off in the middle, perched up against a tree, there was something resembling a man. My friend pushed me and told me to run. We didn't say a word until we got back to the main road because we ran so fast. Turns out my friend saw what looked like a bloody scarecrow leaning against a tree.
In early 2010, I was walking home from work and found myself escorting a young lady to her car. She asked me to escort her, and I was hoping that perhaps I'd get the chance to take her out on a drink or two, or maybe even get her number. No shit, though. She looked really scared. I kept walking with her and was trying to get out of her walk she was so worried about. She would only comment about some really creepy-looking kids that were following her. Being that we were in downtown Seattle, this could amount to anything, so we kept walking and talking. I looked behind us to see if the kids were anywhere near us. Nothing out of the ordinary, and she grabbed my arm really hard and whispered, "That's them. They are about half a block in front of us," and standing there looking at her. So I did the prudent thing, which was to cross the street. I make sure that I lock eyes with the big kid, and I keep in mind that once I get to the lady's car, I'd give them an earful about being a couple of little shits for scaring a lone woman in a metropolitan area. I didn't get scared or anything, but I did notice something strange. They didn't break eye contact with me. Mind you, I don't look like the kind of guy who you'd want to mess around with. Honestly, it's an unconscious front since I'm a bit shy of my look. It reminds people of either a skinhead or a club bouncer, the black tanker boots, and doesn't make me look like a people person either. People break eye contact with me constantly, and these two kids didn't do that, and that was a red flag. I finally got the woman to her car, and she thanked me and made sure to tell me where the local police station was, which was only about 5 blocks away from where we were. She drove off, and I went over to see the kids. Just as I was approaching them, I locked eyes with the tallest one again, but that's when I noticed his eyes were pitch black. I stopped in my tracks and did not know how to proceed. My mind was overwhelmed with information. This was wrong. I looked down at the other one, and he had black eyes as well. I started to feel seriously uneasy, and even though it's not in my nature, I decided at that moment to just walk away. I turned around and left. I'd heard about the black-eyed kids, and there was no way in hell I was going to start a confrontation with one of those. I swear down, that's probably the scariest experience of my life.
Tonight, my sister, brother-in-law, and 2 friends and I all pile into a truck, and we head out to the desert near the old Portland concrete factory. About half an hour into driving, kicking up dust and messing around, everyone gets the chills, and my anxiety starts to flare up. We brush it off as the temperature difference and just keep going. 10 minutes later, we come around a corner and my sister says, "Please tell me you guys just saw that woman." We respond with, "What woman?" She says, "We just passed a woman standing on the side of the road wearing pink, I think it was a pink shirt, and she had blonde hair that was covering her face. She looked dead." I honestly thought she was messing with me, so we turn around and go to the spot where she saw her. No woman. Brother-in-law and I get our flashlights out and look around. "No woman," I tell my sister. She's seeing things, and she insists that she saw a woman, so I decide to check my dash cam footage. Sure enough, there was a woman. She was crossing the road, it looks like, and she just vanishes into thin air. My camera isn't of the best quality by any means, and it was quite dark, but it's clear what we saw. My brother-in-law and I canvassed a 2-mile square radius with flashlights, calling out to the woman because we legitimately thought that someone was lost out in the desert. The entire time, we kept feeling and hearing things around us. Some info to note, this was right next to an extremely murky pond. There is a possibility that her body could be hidden in the pond.
On a 2-week solo backpacking trip, I had 4 days in seclusion between ranger station check-ins. On the first day of the seclusion, I felt like I was being stalked. I lay in my tent that night, and I could hear what sounded like footsteps around my camp, but nothing came close. In the morning, I checked all around and found no evidence of footprints or having any wildlife around me. I broke down camp and took off, trying to put it behind me. The second night was the same thing. I grew so paranoid that when I couldn't hike during the day, I would go over rock, walk through streams, anything to try and break the trail so that I couldn't be tracked. I'd go around a blind turn and then sit there for an hour, waiting to see if anything would come up behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep for more than 10 or 15 minutes before waking up. Finally, I got to the ranger station check-in and told them what I had been experiencing. I went and set up camp as close to the station as I could, and later the rangers offered me to sleep on their couch for comfort. As I could actually sleep, I accepted and stayed the night indoors. I walked out to my camp in the morning and it had been destroyed. My tent was torn on the sides, sleeping bag ripped apart and turned inside out. The rangers came to report, took pictures of everything, and I ended up getting one of the rangers to give me a ride back to base camp so that I could go home the next day. Not sure what was stalking me, but it scares me shitless to this day.
I grew up in a very rural area of the Deep South and spent most of my time riding horses alone in national forests and expensive private properties that bordered our house. There was an old abandoned house 2 miles ride through the woods from me. I often rode by it on my journeys through the woods. Sometimes I tied my horse up, went inside and explored, but there was nothing really of interest. There was just trash and things that looked like electricity bills from the 80s. I think an old woman used to live there based on some pictures that I found. Time went on, and I went away to college, taking my horse with me. I no longer rode past this abandoned house. After graduating from college and moving back home with my horse, I decided to go back to explore the area again. So I rode my horse the 2 miles through the deep woods to get to this house, which itself is probably 1,000 feet from a lonely gravel road that cuts through the forest. It is very secluded and almost creepy. The house is about 3 miles away from a paved road. I am less brave than I used to be, so when I entered the house I felt out of place and slightly scared. But I used my flashlight to explore the rooms anyway. A lot was just as I remembered. Right as I was about to leave, I found half the skeletal calf in the corner of the entry room. I have no idea how the calf got shut inside a building. The doors were firmly shut when I approached it, and also the screen door opened one way, so it was impossible for both to be open at once. For some creature to accidentally wander in, furthermore, the nearest cow pastures were a good bit away from the house. I left the abandoned house with the image in my head of some deviant cruelly trapping a calf in there for sick purposes. I hope I never have to meet the sickos who did that.
It almost felt like a dream. I woke up to my dog Lucy barking. She was upright on the bed where my husband and I were sleeping with our 22-month-old daughter, staring at our door like an unknown stranger was out there rummaging around. I thought she was just freaking out over a house noise. We'd only had her for 3 months and she was still a puppy. It could have been anything. Our roommate, a creak from the house settling, the awnings moving outside in the breeze. I wasn't too concerned initially. I decided the best thing to do would be to open the door and show her that nothing was there. It sounds a bit silly, but that's what we do with our daughter when she gets scared, and I figured that it would work with her puppy too. I opened the door and she raced to the front door. She stood there snarling. It was an angry, violent growl, one I had never heard her make before. I looked groggily at her and opened the baby gate blocking the doorway, planning to open the door and show her that everything was okay. The second my hand reached for the deadbolt, Lucy went wild. She started barking and jumped towards me, and when I touched the metal, she suddenly changed her temper. She whimpered, almost like she was afraid and backing down. As her mannerisms changed, so did mine. I wasn't calm anymore. My heart was racing and sinking at the same time. I had been flooded with a mixture of fear and dread. I looked through the peephole. I can't explain why I looked, but I did. Outside were 2 kids. One was only just a smidgen shorter than I and didn't look much younger. I'm 21, and she looked to be around 16 or 17. She was slender and pale. Her hair was a light shade of honey blonde, and she wore a long, about mid-back, with long, thin, blunt bangs in the front that covered most of her eyes. She wore jeans, a light wash that's popular right now, and a thin-looking, olive-colored pullover-style hoodie. She held the hand of a small girl who looked to be around the age of 4 or 5. She was in the same style jeans as her and a button-down ivory cardigan. The smaller one looked at the floor, shiny. She had the same shade of hair tied back in a ponytail. She held a stuffed toy under her free arm, and it was identical to one my daughter has. As was the style of dress, hadn't it been for the feeling of overwhelming dread and fear, I probably would have asked these children to come in as well as given them a hot beverage to get them out of the bitter cold. Something about them seemed off. At this point, I hadn't made any noise. I hadn't hushed the dog or grumbled, nothing. I hadn't turned on any lights. Those kids had no indicators that I was at the door, and yet the older one spoke. She had a voice that was mature, confident, strong, and accentless. She held her head tilted downwards, and I could see her eyes. She said, "We have to use your phone." I stood frozen in fear. How did she know that I was there? She raised her head to face me directly, and that's when I saw her eyes. There was a reason I couldn't see them through her bangs before. They were black or midnight blue or a dark, dark purple, but nonetheless they were otherworldly. She said, "Our mother is worried." As someone who has always been interested in creepy stories, I knew what she was. The second she looked at me through the door, I have never been one to believe in these things. As a staunch atheist and skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, I had written off many a ghost story from family members and friends eager to tell their tale. I didn't believe. Still, I could not rationalize my way out of this. I was standing with nothing but a thin wooden door between me and a black-eyed kid. There was no questioning what was right in front of me. I did not answer her. Slowly and silently, I backed away from the door, Lucy still cowering at my ankles. She kept talking, "Just let us in and use your phone." I took another step back, and with that step, the tone changed. At first, she seemed polite. Well, when I took that second step back, she became commanding, almost hostile. "We're not going to hurt you. If we wanted to do that, we would have already broken in. Now I'll ask you again. May we come in and use your phone?" Lucy snarled at the door. I inched backward. No, something inside me seemed to be slowly pulling me back towards the door. It wasn't a physical plane so much as a subconscious need to go back and let them in. I went into my room, covered up the window, locked the door, and sat in the dim light of the nightlight. I heard her call me back to the door once more, and then quiet. I didn't go back to sleep that night, and I haven't slept right since. I know from reading about the Beck that they don't come in without permission. I know they haven't hurt anyone, but I fear that I would have been the exception. But this lingering feeling of sadness, this dread when my house is silent at night, this fear of a knock at the door tells me otherwise.
It was June 1987 because it was the baseball season after the Bill Buckner disaster. My girlfriend's parents owned the place. It was in southeast Idaho. It was a pretty big place with lots of acreage. The guy who was the full-time caretaker over the place had just quit, and my girlfriend's dad went out there to find a new caretaker. But the new caretaker couldn't start for 1 month. Her dad offered to pay me $1,200 to go out there, free food, satellite TV and all. I had to keep an eye on the place, feed the dogs, and the horse. I had never been out west, so I took him up on it, and it sounded better than doing landscaping. I spent the time reading, exploring, playing with the dogs, and riding the horse. It was completely uneventful until that night. After the knocking stopped, and dogs stopped barking, I eventually went back to sleep. I didn't freak out that much because there were 2 German shepherds inside with me, and I had a gun. I kept it on my nightstand. I'd been drinking a little but was not drunk by any means. There were several neighbors there were a few miles away. I was kind of thinking that someone had just driven down the wrong driveway. The next morning at the crack of dawn, I opened the front door to let the dogs out and saw a white Chevy Nova sitting in the driveway. It was near the small cabin for the caretaker. The cabin was around 100 yards from the main house. I called my girlfriend's dad and asked him if he knew anyone who would make that model of car. He said he didn't, and he called the police directly. Police showed up, asked me a few questions, and walked around the property for an hour or so. The car was locked, and the police had it towed. I have no idea if it was broken down or not. There was only 1 set of tire tracks coming into the house. A few days later, my girlfriend's dad called me up to say the guy who owned the car was missing and to call the police if anything weird happened again. I have no idea who the guy was at all. I don't know how long he was missing or when he was reported missing or who reported him missing. He was just missing. My girlfriend's dad didn't know much about it either. After about a month, I go back home. The girlfriend and I break up shortly thereafter. I see her out of town a few months later and asked her if she ever found out what happened to the guy. All she knows is that the guy was found unalive. Apparently, he took his own life about 30 miles away. It happened several months after that incident at the house, and he was found a couple of days after he took his own life. I asked her how he did it, where he was found, and who found him, and I got nothing, and I never saw her again.
One night, me and 2 friends were all walking around at night in the fields of a small town in Michigan. Our destination was a junkyard tucked away behind several fields, home to rusted-out cars, semi-trailers, farm equipment, etc. We were cutting through the fields to avoid the trigger-happy farmers that live around there. We're near enough there when we get fouled by a stream too wide to leap. It was late autumn, and wet feet would be uncomfortable, so we backtracked into the adjacent field. From our corner of the field, there was a tree line that ran east to west, and southward, the land rose into a large hill. We stood for a moment discussing our options, when my eyes were drawn to a large white boulder seeming to glow in the moonlight. It was around 75 yards away, and I was idly staring at it when we moved. It unfolded, standing up to about 10 or 12 feet. This bipedal skeleton thing of pure white with long limbs. For the space of a second it looked at us and then took off. I think it was running, but it may have been gliding or flying. Honestly, I'm unsure, but it crossed the field up and over the hill, a distance of probably 100 yards, and in about 2 to 3 seconds, in complete silence. It was gone. Only 2 of the 3 of us saw it, and after a few minutes of incoherent gibbering, we tried to rationalize, explain, and figure out what the hell we saw. We decided that it must be an alien. A year later, I was at a party, and the subject of aliens came up. I said, "I've seen an alien." Some people reply, "Yeah, let me guess, in Saranac, right?" I confirm. We exchange mutual looks of awe, and he directs me to this Eric fella who grew up in said town. Eric tells me that he has seen strange things his whole life, lights in the sky, etc., but no humanoid beings. Fast forward another year and a half, Will, sir, and I get a phone call from an acquaintance who was sitting at work when he noticed a young girl staring at him strangely. He eventually walks up to him and says, "I feel like I need to talk to you." She proceeds to tell him that her friend's dad is the head of a vampire clan in a town near Saranac. My friend remembers my story and weird things in the area, and he asks her if he knows anything about Saranac. She gets very defensive and eventually reveals that Saranac is an alleged breeding ground for dragons. Yeah, to this day, I'm not certain if I saw a dragon, alien, or vampire or whatever, but I did a bit of poking around, and I heard from a girl that lived there that since she was a kid, she's seen random 15-foot scorch marks on roadsides in the middle of fields. I'm honestly clueless, but I know what I saw. If only I knew what it actually was.
When I was 12 years old, I went to a week-long scout camping trip with my troop. Our campsite was notably isolated from the majority of the other sites, so even though there were hundreds of kids at the camp overall, there were probably 5 or 6 of us and 2 or 3 leaders in our site. I shared a tent with 2 other kids. Being the anti-scout that I was, I bought a full-sized cot to sleep on, while the other kids slept on the ground. I am a horrible sleeper in any conditions other than my own bed, so I've always taken sleeping pills when I go camping. Sometimes I have strange reactions to them, where I don't sleep well and get dreams confused with reality. On our final night at camp, it was storming with lightning everywhere. We were in a creeped-out mood, telling scary stories before we went to sleep. I couldn't wait to go home the next morning. I took my pills and somehow managed to fall asleep. I woke up a few hours into the night. I could barely make out the crouched-over figure of a tall man. I'd woken up because he was gently grabbing my leg. He didn't look like any of my leaders from what I can tell. Confused, groggy, and horrified, I said, "What?" The figure remained silent. After a week on these sleeping pills, I knew that they could make me confused. I closed my eyes, hoping it was just the pills combined with the night of scary stories. I felt the gentle grip on my leg again. The figure was standing there. "What?" I said again, and this time more panicked. Suddenly, still without a word, the man leaned down on the ground next to me, where I couldn't see him because I was elevated. I couldn't hear anything strange happening, but I was filled with so much terror that I couldn't even bring myself to peek over the edge of my cot. I was still unbelievably tired and confused, and in my frightened stupor, I convinced myself that the sleeping pills were causing me to blend nightmares with reality. I drifted in and out of a horrified semi-sleep for the rest of the night, wondering what exactly had happened. I never recalled hearing anything notable or seeing the man leave the tent, and once the sun began to dimly light the tent, I mustered the courage to look over the edge of the cot. The kid next to me was asleep and appeared unharmed. If this were all the story, though, I would have dismissed it as a weird reaction to my sleeping pills. But then, the next morning over breakfast, the kid who had been next to me asked me if our other tent mate if someone had gone into our tent overnight. The other tent mate said he assumed one of us was getting up to pee and had gone back to sleep. When we all confirmed that none of us had gotten up in the night, we started freaking out, egging our leaders and the other scouts for them to admit if one of them had played a joke on us. Well, they had a history of sleepwalking. Nobody had any idea what we were talking about. I don't know what someone's motives would have been to come into our tent and to gently touch my leg and be silent, unless I have some serious mental blocks. There was no kind of physical violation that I can recall. just a strange, quiet intruder.